Hey, cool kids. Welcome into the Cool Grandpa podcast. I'm excited to have you here this week. This week, we have Daniel Crandall on. Now, Daniel is a nostalgic storyteller who advocates for honoring the generations in your family. Daniel is part of a father and daughter team, which is really kind of a unique situation. And together, they write and publish books capturing the valuable life lessons of parents and grandparents. I want you to visit alisona.com and learn how to capture and publish your own family history. When you contact them, make sure that you mention Cool Grandpa for a free publishing Q&A training session that they are willing to offer for the listeners. Now, I'm going to have the link to Alisona down in the show notes, so it's easy to get to if you don't happen to have a pencil and pen real handy. Before we get started, I do want to remind you that I've got the Cool Grandpa podcast store over at my website, cool-grandpa.us. Take a minute, go in there, browse around, see what's available that you might like for you or for the cool grandpa in your life. I've got some caps. I've got some polo shirts like the one I'm wearing. I've got some mouse pads, some tumblers, some different things over there. So be sure to go check that out. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe to this channel. I want to make sure that we get all the valuable information and the great stories available to as many people as we can. So without further ado, let's jump into this conversation with Daniel. Hi, Daniel. Welcome to the Cool Grandpa podcast. I'm glad to have you back on. This is going to be a fun conversation.
Super excited about it, Greg. Thanks for inviting me back. Not everyone wants to hear from me a second time.
Yeah, well, this is going to be a little bit further in depth. I think we got to this when we had you on the first time. You were talking about your grandfathers, but then you were also talking about publishing and some of the training and some of the other work that you do. And this time around, we're going to get into another aspect of the projects that you do. And this one's going to be fun because we're going to be talking about the dynamics of a family business when you start to have family and even, a daughter or son that's working with you.
Yes, absolutely. The first time I think I mentioned that I'm working on my grandfather's book, the one who left me his memoir, his journals, his notes. And at that point, I think when we talked, my publishing company was fairly young and small. And so interestingly, that's absorbed most of my last year has been working in this publishing business and getting more and more of people's stories and family histories and things like that, both for my publishing business, and I also provide that service for other publishing businesses, which is a strange segue. I do the same thing for me, and I'm also doing it for others because that's just something where I'm passionate about, and it's really connected me with other authors and with other publishers. So it's exciting. It's an exciting little niche to be in.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting too, because not a lot of people, I think about capturing family stories as something worth publishing.
Yeah.
My wife's family, there's a book, the Mangum book, that's her last name, and they go back to where they were kind of chased out of Ireland way back when for breaking a window, and the guy stowed away on a ship back in the, I think, early 1700s. But somebody did that genealogy and produced a book about their family. But I think a lot of times it's just notes here and there, or maybe finding a journal, not necessarily creating this artifact.
Yeah, it's interesting because my kind of a personal slogan is that everyone has a story. And if you know somebody intimately, you know that's true. Like if you get to know somebody, literally everybody has a story. I think where we lose people is feeling that that story is valuable, or that it's fresh or new or exciting or interesting in any way. Some people truly believe that their life or their story is not interesting, but I have never met a person where that's true. And And I talk to everybody because I'm not really an introvert. I don't mind meeting people and talking and getting their story. And when I hear, even just like in a grocery store or a, lady at the checkout, if you tap in and just ask a little question about their day or when they started, and they start to tell you about that they've been on their feet for 10 hours, all of a sudden that story is interesting. Like the story of today is interesting. And so I find that there's no end to that, but there's so much wisdom and like courage, faith, experience, whatever that person has been through, that comes out when you start to listen to those stories. So,
Oh, I agree. To me, it's the little hidden things that's in somebody's story or somebody's background. And it could be something as simple as, on my way to the grocery store on Tuesdays, I stop off at the cemetery and put a flower on my dog's grave. Oh, okay. Well, suddenly we know that there was a dog there. It obviously meant enough that somebody carves out time during the day. So, yeah, I agree.
and now you have a whole chapter, right? Which, if you tap into it, who is Teddy the dog? And like, that was my grandfather's dog. But yeah, that's a whole interesting story on its own, and people love to hear it.
Oh, yeah. I want to back up just a little bit and have you introduce the publishing company and the books that you're doing. Allison, Alisona. We were just doing this, and I was
That's
overthinking
so
it.
funny.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So there's an interesting story there. There's a long title to our publishing company. It's Pixel Glyph Press, but that's a technical and functional name that kind of, we publish a lot of different content under that. I have French authors, historians, I have all kinds of different things. But Alisona is a small little part of the area where we live in Middle Tennessee. And I have a friend, and often this is how it starts, who is he's probably 10 years older than me. I'm turning 51 in just a few days, and I'm not sure his age, but 61, 65, somewhere in there. And he's had battles with cancer and stuff like that, but he lives down in this Alisona area. And he loves to share his story. But not only that, he grew up in this area. His wife grew up in this area, and they're connected with all these people who are the original residents of this area. And so I quickly just got excited and tapped into that. And we just started Alisona Books, starting telling the story of people just first from this local area, but then realizing that all of the clients I was working with and I get a lot from New England, and where I grew up, a lot in that area, all the way from New Jersey up to Maine and New York. Anyway, those stories go way beyond, and I kept the Alisona name because that has a story in itself, right? It's just a story of histories, local histories. So it's literally Allison with an A on the end, Alisona.com. But that, that is a history book in itself. And so whether we rebrand things or whatever, I'm opening that up to a whole lot more people and families. And you and I talked earlier about the fact that my own family has their story, and people ask, like, I shared with you about my grandfather's growing up, but now my daughter is now capturing the story of her grandfather, my wife's father, who's still around. My grandfathers are deceased. My father is deceased, but my wife's father is around, and my daughter's grandfather, right? And he has a huge story to tell, and it's never been captured. It's never been written down. He has so much. He spends so much time telling us stories around the table and sharing and stuff, and we're just like, nobody has captured this content. Nobody has done anything in our family. He's got 5 kids, and I think 18 grandchildren or something. Um, and so, but here we are, like, you know, my daughter's 18. She's at the point where she can take this on herself. And so she has. It's a pretty exciting project that we're doing now. So,
Oh, that's cool. And uh, how did she get motivated to start talking to your father-in-law? Was that something to do with you guys working together with the business and capturing these stories, and there was like a light bulb moment, like, oh, I could do this with Grandpa?
yeah, it was really just maybe 3 or 4 months ago. Um, and she got passionate at about 16 years old, and she's a bookworm anyway. But she got passionate about um, doing more with books and republishing some vintage books and designing her own books. And I came out of the publishing industry 25 years ago, and I'm back in it. But it was her inspiration that made me realize 2 years ago that we should really just start our own publishing company. I've published books and edited books for other people on the side, but going into, restarting, entering that publishing world again, I got very excited because she was excited about it. And so we worked together in that. So I've been working with her for 2 years, in the publishing business, in the publishing world. And, so that's kind of how we got started. But she knows, she's been working on vintage books and some memoirs from people. I'm trying to think what else she's done. She's done some art books and children's books. But she sees me working and serving other publishing companies where I help them do the work, the production work of putting a book together, of gathering the images, of editing and all that stuff. And she's like, she helped me with my own grandfather's book. And then she said, well, who is getting Grappy's stories? They're so great. I said, that's another one we really should be tapping into. He had 35 years with the Boston Symphony. And so he's out there in the world, in all kinds of public records, and yet nobody has really captured and told his story, and we don't want that to get lost before he's gone.
Oh, that's awesome. And 35 years in the Boston Symphony. Was he associated with the Pops at all? And forgive my ignorance if it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah. Chester Schmitz of the Boston Symphony and Boston Pops. So it's the Boston Pops is the summer season of the Boston Symphony, and it does have different members sometimes. So fair enough to be confused about that. But he was the tuba for 35 years with the Boston Symphony and the Boston Pops.
So, okay, so he was probably there with Arthur Fiedler.
Yeah, he started under Arthur Fiedler, and then John Williams was there for a short time and became the conductor laureate or something. I forget what they call that, where guest conductor, where anytime you're in town you can conduct. And then so he has his own stories of, well, he's a friend of John Williams, and John Williams actually wrote the Jabba the Hutt solo is based on Chester Schmitz's tuba performances. And so there's a lot, and this is public record. Like John Williams talks about how he based some of his like love of brass. He was always a trumpet lover, and so his early stuff had a lot of trumpet. But when he started conducting the Boston Symphony and realized what Chester Schmitz could do on a tuba, he started writing more for deep brass, and that inspired like Jabba the Hutt solo. So I'm like, those are big stories, right?
Right. Yeah. No, that's awesome. That's the great thing that and a lot of times as we get older, we just don't bring them up because we don't think the grandkids are that interested. They're not going to know who Jabba the Hutt is. They're not going to be interested in they're watching Bluey or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, when you start to dig down and uncover those, that becomes really an interesting experience. And I mean, it's something that affects the family, I think, as well. It's that family story of not only is it just grandpa in isolation, oh, by the way, he knew John Williams and had this, but then how did that then affect his relationship with his wife and his kid? The boost of if John Williams goes, hey, I wrote this based on kind of what you can do.
Well, and there's a deeper story to be told, which I'm more interested in personally. And it's the family story that starts like when he was young. Like, how did you like get tuba? Because he grew up a poor boy, and like, how did you get one of the top 5 tuba positions in the world? Like, that's kind of a crazy story in itself. Those are the stories that really intrigue me and that I feel like sometimes get lost, but they're the most inspirational. And it doesn't have to be, tuba for the Boston Symphony. Sometimes it can be, how did you manage to, work 2 full-time jobs just so that you could afford for 5 children to go to college? Like, those stories are amazing, and we all have those in our family history, but we don't drill into like what it meant. What did your day-to-day look like to go from your desk job to your milk delivery job so that you could go back to your desk job and, maybe got 2 hours of sleep in between there? Like, those kinds of things, that's kind of a story that comes out of my stepfather's father. Like, I hear him talk about that, but that will never really be captured in its entirety because those people are deceased. And so, yeah, I love drilling into that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit, I think, from a family perspective. We'll see if this analogy works for us, but I lived in the Washington, D.C. area. And initially, when you first moved there, it's like, let's go check the monuments, let's go do some things. And then you stop because it's there. You can do it anytime you want. And I think sometimes it takes out of town relatives or friends before you go visit someplace that you had no idea, but it was on their list, right? So with family, I think sometimes you can take it for granted. Well, I'll ask grandma about something later. We're just doing Thanksgiving today and we'll deal with, I'll bring it up later, and it just never really happens.
Yeah, I'll visit it later, or maybe someday I'll go back there. And I think I like that analogy because it's something we all, I think, experience. But if you take that even another step, like when you go visit that monument because your family wanted to see it or your out of town friends wanted to see it, when you're first there, you look at it and you're like, yeah, it's just like I remember. But then they start to ask questions and you're like, oh, well, I never thought about it that way, or I never saw it that way. And, if you take the moment to set that time aside and actually re-engage it, you find that there's depth beyond what you saw the first time. There's more to the story. There's more to be had and understood about it. So I think that, yeah, always taking it deeper. Like, and it's funny because you and I talked about my daughter being on this call today, and she actually had scheduled this time to be with her grandfather to record his stories. And so she was stressed about trying to leave him early to get back here. I said, no, don't. That's not the point. The point is, let's get grandpa's stories while you can. Greg will have more questions for you later. Is what I told.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to find out too, is with maybe your daughter's experience, your experience, when you sit down and start talking with somebody that doesn't really tell stories, maybe they're not the family storyteller, maybe they're more of an introvert, whatever it is, how do you start to draw people out to get those? Because when I'm doing interviews sometimes with people that aren't normally doing a podcast interview or whatever, it can be a little bit before you start to find a groove and start to get maybe some trust going. But how's that with you?
Yeah, I agree. I'll take one kind of crack at like one thing I encounter, and I've mentioned this, I don't know, maybe I even said it in the last podcast, but when I find that grandmothers are willing to talk, and we know that women just use more words than men and share more emotion than men. This is just kind of a psychology thing. But in the histories, grandmas talk about stories and what they did at home in families and their memories of, giving a baby a bath in the, in a basin in the wash basin in the kitchen sink, or things like that. Like, those are kind of grandma type stories. But without fail, I'm pretty sure without fail, grandpa stories tend to be about, and they're a little harder to draw. They're a little slower to just share, but they tend to circle around accomplishments and victories and work, and jobs I held, and often historic timelines, because men tend to think a little bit more in that linear way, and so, like, when I'm asking those stories, there are a couple things I can do to trigger those memories, but like trying to get the timeline right, because the minute I get it wrong, they will correct me. So I'll dive in there and make my presumptions on the timeline, because then they will set the timeline straight for me, and that's what I'm looking for. So I'm not afraid to get it wrong, because I know that they'll set me straight, and I need to hear that. That kind of the second thing is, asking about, like, victorious stories, failure stories, jobs, tends to trigger, like, even though it's not the most interesting thing, it triggers like a time in your life. I can give a perfect example. Is my grandpa worked as a baker for a short time. And for years, I would hear him tell that as a brief timeline. Like, I worked for a baker for a couple of years, and then I went to the paint factory, right? That little tidbit, like, there's 2 years of his life where he worked as a baker. Like, there's got to be something in that, right? Did those 2 years just pass and you never left the bakery? What happened? Like, and so turns out that was before he got married. And so, okay, so you were single, you had a single life working at the bakery. Were you there early? Were you there late? Anyway, I started just asking about what was it like to be a baker. Were you, like, in charge of the pastries, or were you just like a line worker? And just little things about his job. Finally, it was almost annoyed that I was picking so much into this story, that he started telling me stories, because I was getting so many things wrong. He started just like, no, it wasn't that. No, it wasn't that. And he started just telling me what his story was about. And so, while I wasn't trying to be annoying, the story that came out of that is he said, after I married your grandmother, it was their first holiday. I don't remember if it was Thanksgiving or Christmas, but he said, I'm a baker. I'm going to make a pie. She was excited. She left him in the kitchen, and, apple pie, I think it was, which is a New England thing for sure. And this is up in Boston. He made his pie, and grandma was there listening to the story. She came into the room and she said there was flour everywhere. There was flour on the floor. There was flour on the ceiling. And this is like an old Boston house where the ceilings are like 12 feet high, right? She's like, there was flour on the ceiling. She said, I chased him out of that kitchen. I told him, you're never baking in my kitchen again. And he never, ever, ever, according to him and her, ever cooked a meal again in her kitchen like that. And I'm like, that story is tremendous. Like, how could we not have gotten that story at every single Thanksgiving dinner? Right. That should have been told. And so it's that kind of thing where, just like, I don't know, just probing, it just triggered something where they both had a component of that story, and they both were excited and thrilled to tell it. But I think they just thought it wasn't interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that is so interesting. Like that's like a movie scene. Like it's beautiful. I love it. So, yeah, I think I don't want to call it pestering, but I want to say like genuine interest in, like I have no idea what it's like to be a baker. At that point, I didn't actually. I did work as a baker later on, which is another story. Um, but I had no idea what's it like to be a baker. Like genuine interest, drilling into that. And he told me a bunch of stories about, you know, working on the line, egg washes on the top of the pie, and just all these things that are vaguely interesting. But then the real family life stories came out of that. So I don't know if that's useful or helpful, but
Yeah, it is, because what strikes me there was when you're saying about timelines, and if you're wrong, then people want to correct it. Is I think it does. There's something psychological with guys where sometimes it can be taken the wrong way, where we want things correct, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're in a struggle to be right. It's just more of a no. This is kind of how it does. I don't know what it is. It's a biological thing, a psychological thing, whatever it is. But it's you argue over whether something happened when you were 12 years old or 10 years old.
yeah. Well, it's that same thing. If you look at there are these funny stories circulating that are true about what men have contributed and what would be missing in the world if men didn't give their input. And the list is it's things like hairspray, press on nails. Like it's all these women's things, right, that men have come up with because a woman was complaining about something. And I don't mean to be trite about that, right, but it's that nature of the guy wanting to set it straight, wanting to fix it, wanting to make it better. Like that nature, which can be annoying, also leads him to solve the problem of broken nails. Like who cares? But it was a guy who invented those. And maybe a woman would have, I don't know, but it wasn't, and it's just hairspray. Like a guy invented that because he was sick of his wife complaining about her hair falling down. Or I don't know the reasons, but like that need to fix it, that need to set it straight. Yeah, it can be a funny thing, but it can really lead to, that's why when we publish a man's book, a grandfather, usually an older gentleman, it usually involves like a timeline of his work and stories of successes. But then you go back and you drill into, this little piece in the timeline. Tell me about that certificate, that honor that you got. Why did they honor you that way? And they often give like a trite story of why they honor, but you drill back and you drill back and you drill back, and eventually it comes to like their life philosophy that led them to have a certain character and a certain work ethic that led them to, build things a certain way and not let there be compromise in the product, or, and then all of a sudden you've captured like the essence of the story that really made them the man they were, at least in this instance or in this tale.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, and it's a great strategy. If anybody's talking to dads or grandpas or uncles or whatever, throw something in that is wrong, and then watch the course correction. That could lead to, being told that you can never cook in my kitchen again.
Yeah, absolutely fun.
Yep. Can you walk us through like an engagement when somebody reaches out to you to do a family history? How do they typically make that connection, and then walk us through kind of the process that you have?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are always things we know in time. And so it's really pretty simple to kind of start with like, what are the fun, interesting things? But then when you start just listing a few things you know about someone, you almost instantly realize that you're not sure. Like you think you know something, and then you write down like, when were grandma and grandpa married? Well, this is their 50th anniversary. So they were married on this date. Was it that year or that year? And all of a sudden you're not sure, like you've written it down. The desire to write something down comes with it the need to be correct. And so, like, but that's the kind of thing you share. You write it down and then you share. Well, wait a minute, Grandma, were you married this year or that year? Was it before or after World War II ended? What exactly happened? Um, was it raining? Was it, you know, a simple question like, was it raining on your wedding day tells all of a sudden somebody shares all kinds of stories about what happened because of the weather. It wasn't raining, but man, it was windy. We tried to light the candles in the church, and the windows were open because it was warm. And so the candles kept going out, like those are all of a sudden cool stories that wouldn't have come out if you hadn't asked, was it raining on your wedding day? Um, and, I think a timeline works, especially if it's men. How long were you employed by this person? Why did you leave? It was such a great job, wasn't it? Well, no, I hated my boss. Well, no, I knew I had it in me to start something new and be more efficient. I knew I could do better. Or I just was sick of it, and I was doing such a bad job they fired me because I was so bored. Like those are all interesting stories. There's that timeline that really works. And with, I think timeline with grandmas, it tends to be like birth and death timelines, and, when we moved from this house to that house, this city to that city, or big things that happened in the world that changed, the course of your life. All of a sudden we went to men won't, I find it funny, men won't tell that all of a sudden we went from being rich to being poor. But women remember that vividly. It totally changed. We went from a big house to a small house because all of a sudden his job, he was trying to start his own business, and we didn't have enough money to do this. And so, just listening kind of to what that person really cares about, and then just kind of tapping into it. But, you ask, like, what triggers the stories when you have someone who's quiet. Grandparents, I think, are more than willing to share their stories, but I feel like they've often been shut down. Yeah, we've heard that, Grandma. And my daughter is picking up the stories of her grandfather, but she's having to go do it at a time when nobody else is there, which is interesting because he's got all these stories, but so often one of the kids or grandkids will say, yeah, we've heard that story, Grandpa. Yeah, you told us that last week. And it's like, it's true. It's absolutely true. But, how about when Grandpa starts to tell the story, we make that the subject of our conversation instead of saying, yeah, you told us that. I want to like dive into that and say, how do we make that, like, how does that become the interesting part of this conversation? Now Grandpa wants to share this story. How can I drill into it and get him to tell me part of the story that he's never told before? That becomes the interest. And then, then asking him, have you ever told anyone? I never heard that part before. Are you sure that's true? Like, did so-and-so know this? Or, does Grandma know that you had a girlfriend back then? Like, do you talk with her about that? Yeah, those like make the story interesting, and bits of scandal or whatever that you can bring up. All of that is there. And I don't know where I'm meandering a little bit, but I think what I'm trying to get to in my mind is that these are so valuable, and I'm in the right business for me. I know I am, because I feel and I sense the value of people's stories, and I think they appreciate that when I'm talking with them, that I'm truly engaged and interested. But if you acknowledge that your parents, your grandparents, that what they've experienced, what they've gone through influences you, or it influenced you, and where you're at today, it becomes very interesting to learn about how they dealt with something, how they managed a situation.
How do they tend to react when you have cameras or recording devices and lights and some different things? Because you're not just putting this is how old we are. You're not just putting a tape recorder out there and hitting play and record. You're actually doing some video, and you're doing some other production with these stories.
Yeah. So, we've come to a place in this world where an iPhone is adequate, or a good Google Pixel or whatever. Like, you don't have to go to the moon with microphones and cameras. Just get out a phone and, set it up on a tripod so that nobody's touching it, and just start recording. Pretty quickly, people forget. Pretty quickly, people forget that they have this recording device in front of them. I don't think I've never had a person like freeze up because of the camera. And I've had bigger cameras on people. But I also know that, I ignore the camera. I don't fiddle with it. I don't try to get the lighting right and try to make this beautiful video. I would rather capture a valuable story than to make sure my lighting is TV quality. I can always edit a little bit later, but if they're sitting in the dark and that's the footage you got as they tell and share the story, that's super. Like, that's interesting. I'd rather have them for real in their living room than, well lit in the studio. I think it really is a unique situation. We're used to Zoom calls now, though, and now that parents, grandparents are comfortable getting on their phone or getting on camera to do a quick conversation or talk with the grandkids or stuff, just hit record. Like, just hit record in those moments. It's amazing how valuable that can be moving forward. So, I think that kind of answers the camera question, but I just want to say one more thing. Like, there's casual, and then there's really drilling into stories. Be aware, if you're recording something, ask, that's the moment when you have them, ask the question, ask the thing you're wondering about. Like, if I'll give just a story example, right? If I'm sitting with my mom, who lives up in New Hampshire, if I get her on the camera and I have her grandkids, my children, chatting with her or whatever, I'll be like, Mom, at the end of this call, I want to ask you about your recipe for this. And then after she's done talking with the kids, I'll say, I want to record this, and I'll record it. And then I will ask her about her recipe for such and such that she made at Thanksgiving dinner for 30 years, right? Her talking about that recipe is never going to be just a dull conversation listing ingredients. It's going to be interesting. She's going to talk about the time she forgot an ingredient, or the time, or the fact that my dad always hated it, but she still made it for 30 years anyway. She always put extra onions in it, knowing that dad hated it, but he wasn't going to eat it anyway because he hated onions. So, just like these kinds of things, that all of a sudden becomes an interesting part of the story that can be written, shared, told, saved for later. So,
Oh, that's awesome. Tell me a little bit about the packages that you have for working with people that want you to come in and interview their grandparents or interview a family member.
Yeah, well, we do just a basic book, which is, um, you know, around 100 pages. And everything I do, I don't, I don't put too specific requirements on it because, or limitations rather, because if there's something there of value, let's do it. Let's get it. If someone's, if we're down the road and someone says this happened, never like, well, you didn't pay for that. Like, I can't stand that. This is about capturing people's stories. And so genuinely, I want to partner with families to just let's get the story. But, the kind of the simplest package is let's publish a book that's 100 pages, about 100 pages. And um, I sit down and we do interviews. We do, whether it's Zoom interviews, I do them locally here. Um, and I work with another publishing company where we actually will travel to do interviews. And that's been very important in cases where people are like losing their mind, their memory, stuff like that. Taking 3 days to fly out to somewhere where grandma lives in a facility and actually sit with her to capture some of those lucid moments, to go through pictures in person and see what she remembers. She might not remember this morning, but she might remember this afternoon. And so being present is a strange thing and difficult sometimes, but that's kind of the second package where we're willing to travel and actually do like record video interviews and stuff like that. And then kind of at a higher level, I'm actually doing full family history, kind of a website that gathers images, information, videos, and also includes a book, a published book. And when I say published, it doesn't have to be publicly published for the world. It's published for the family. So it's a professional quality production that could be published and sold if that's the desire of the family. And we do that for where there's like a business history involved. Sometimes that will get published and we'll end up selling 200 or 1,000 copies to people that are interested in that story. So.
Oh, sure. I imagine that would be something similar to somebody that's had a hardware store in a town for 100 years. And this is not only the family history, but it's the history of the hardware store and the history of the town.
Yes. Yeah. That's actually a good example. I don't have one just like that, but that would be a good example. I'm working on one right now for a gentleman, and I don't want to name names, but this gentleman was with IBM in the early days for a very long time and involved in inventions and stuff like that, and then proceeded to start his own company. And so there's a lot of like business history, and they send that out to all of like their old friends and investors that were involved back then and stuff. There's a very large group of people that were interested in his story. So,
oh, very cool. That's awesome. Have there been any unexpected surprises that you've experienced with working with clients? And I'm not necessarily talking super scandalous stuff, but stuff that maybe you learned that was like, I had no idea this person, was doing this. I don't know, somebody that used to wrestle alligators, but they work on Wall Street, something kind of out of left field with people.
well, yeah, I mean, there are some. I did a story with a family recently where they, and I don't want to get too heavy, honestly, but they unloaded a lot of psychological baggage around. They had 3 children. One of their children took his own life on drugs, um, and had been in and out of rehab and stuff but the family was a very high profile family, and all this was very hush hush. Like nobody knew anything about what was going on. But when it came out in this story, I was like, it was just a lot and heavy, and they really wanted to share. They really wanted the truth out there of what he had gone through, because later on they kind of saw the value of, their struggle and sharing that with other people that were struggling and investing in, he went on to make a lot of money. The man whose story this is, he went on to be very successful and make a lot of money, but always had an affinity for contributing to local family funds and, tragedy in families and drug rehabilitation for teens and like things that were connected. You never really knew why he was so passionate about these causes and helping these people, but it was all very, very personal. And so I don't think that book will even go public. And that's so far removed. They'll never know I'm telling this story, but it's like, those are wow moments where I'm not even sure if I want to continue probing and asking questions. And yet when they're willing to share, you need to be open to listening at that moment. And I was crying. Like, I'm a crier. I listen to stories, I cry. So those were hard interviews, and probably nobody will ever see those weren't even video. They were just audio interviews, but nobody will ever hear the tapes. Apart from the person who had to transcribe all that. But super valuable stories came out of that. And, stuff that, well, I don't know, it kind of changed. It even had an impact on me. I'm just publishing and writing these. Like, it's not my family, but it had an impact on me, on how I saw the family, how I saw the tragedy, how I saw the son's struggle. So yeah, I guess that would be an example. I haven't gotten the alligator wrangler yet. I'm trying to think.
Right. Well, because you never know. I mean, to your point, sometimes people are like, well, what I did when I was 23 doesn't really matter because now I'm upper management at yada, yada, yada. And, that was back then. And then you're like, wait a second, Grandpa worked ski patrol at Jackson Hole. How did we not know,
Right.
Grandma was a swimsuit model back in the day. How did we not know this? So, yeah.
That's funny that you say those stories. I just took my children skiing for the first time this last winter. And it's November now. They're talking about going skiing again. They loved it so much. We did a whole week out in North Carolina, their first time ever. And I had planned on skiing maybe 3 days, figuring they'd be exhausted. We did 5 days of skiing, and they were not exhausted. They were like, we have to do that again this winter. I'm like, okay, maybe.
Right.
It was a big deal. I was shocked because my wife and I grew up skiing. And, but during that, I'm talking about how, did you know Grandma, she just turned 80 actually, but in her 70s, she worked local ski patrol because she loved skiing so much that if you just taught one lesson and did a weekend of ski patrol, you got a free season's pass. So she's like, so I'll do that. And so they're like, really? Anyway, yeah. So the ski story just kind of, but that became part of family lore now, where my oldest son didn't experience skiing till he was 20 years old. He snowboarded the whole time, but he loved it. Wants to know if he's as good as I was. I'm like, well, no, I grew up skiing. Still at 20, after 5 days, he was still trying to beat me on the slopes. I'm 51. I still could beat him hands down because I'm good and I've done it all my life. You know what I mean? Like, that's the competition. And then him learning that his grandma skis too. Like, yeah, if you go up to New England, if you just fly up there, I promise you she'll take you skiing 2 or 3 days. Like, that's just a thing. She would love to. That'd be her. And so, yeah, it has connected all of a sudden grandchildren with their grandmother, the fact that she skis. Mm-hmm. So just that shocked them that at 80 she's still skiing. So.
Oh, that's all. Yeah, you have to go over to Vermont and stuff. The one that I used to do, I did it once or twice, was Jay's Peak or Jay's Peak. up there in Vermont and all that, and just had a blast. But yeah, that's always funny when you hear these stories about like, really, so and so did Grandpa was a lion tamer at the zoo.
But the connections it makes,
Yeah.
it is so amazing that it does draw people together. So,
Hey, as we start to wrap this up, do you have any advice for people, whether teenagers or adults, that want to start to record some family history and, kind of just get the ball rolling? Maybe they don't have, aims of doing books, but wanting to get this thing down.
yeah, I think you have to really take somebody's personality into account. Um, my daughter wanted to interview my grandfather or her grandfather, my wife's father. And, she was asking for tips, like, how do I start this? I said, well, he's a very powerful man, and she's, 18-year-old girl. And so, like, he's going to direct this. I said, just let him direct it. You don't need to control the conversation. Let him tell the stories he wants to tell, but show genuine interest in the parts that you feel are interesting, that where he's not told the story before, like probe into that, ask questions. And if he's not interested, just skip over it. Know that it might circle back around later. He might say that's not the interesting part. Well, ignore it then. That's fine. Like let him control it, because he's got so much to tell. There are things you want to hear, but maybe he's not prepared to share those yet, or maybe he has things that he feels like are valuable. Let him get out all those things that he feels like are valuable, because the purpose of this, yeah, we want to get to the meat of the story so that it impacts us, but that's a bit of a selfish motive too. And it's fine because we're doing the work and we see the value in that. But like recognizing that he will feel valued and he will be honored if you let him guide and let him tell the stories that he's passionate about, that he feels like make a difference or have made a difference in his life or to people around him. Like start there. Start with letting him decide what's valuable. So, what does grandma always talk about? Is grandma a cook? Ask her about cooking. Ask her about her recipes. Is grandma, did grandpa work for a company for a long time? That's fine. Maybe he doesn't want to talk about it because it was just a boring thing. But like, what does he share about working there? I think breaking through that barrier, that wall, is about like, there's a bit of trust. They've been told not to share the story again about X, Y, or Z. Well, like you can almost flip the script in a sense. Like nobody wants to hear your story about, about the, and I can't think of anything. Nobody wants to hear that story anymore, Grandpa, but nobody's ever recorded it. So tell us one more time and make sure you don't leave out any of the funny parts. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
Like that's an invitation to tell the story you always tell, but ham it up this time, I don't know, like anything, like it really is about letting that person either lead if they're a leader, or if they're not a leader, let them follow. Just, you can guide the story. You can tell your own stories. If I share about the time I was fired from a job, maybe Grandpa will talk about that time he was fired, when he always avoids it. He never wants to talk about it. So maybe I need to share my story, my vulnerable story first, because Grandpa's so quiet, and then ask for his advice. Say, I still haven't recovered from that time. It was 20 years ago, but I feel like my career never took off from that point. Like I lost that job. My salary's never come back up since then. what would you do? Like, what do you have? Now I'm honoring I'm looking for his advice, his wisdom. And from that, I bet he'll share part of his story. So, I think it really is about relationship. The point of this is to connect anyway. The absolute worst case scenario is you get no video footage, you get no audio footage that's any good, and you have this amazing connection with your grandparent, right? I'm like, it's a win. Like, there is no scenario around this where you lose. There are only levels of success, right? If it didn't work the first time, ask for help. My video looked horrible. How do I take a better video? Ask me for help. I am happy to put together training that will teach people, and I'll give it to you for free. Like, this is how to do a better video. Like, just come to me and ask. Like, I do this stuff all the time. I would love to help people with that kind of thing. So, these are valuable moments. Let's do them. Let's take advantage. And just when you start the process, you see the value in it.
As we wrap up here, what's the best way for people to reach out to you, learn more about some of the services you provide, and then if they do have questions about lighting or how do I work my iPhone, how should they get in touch with you?
Yeah. Well, Alisona.com is it is about publishing family histories, and that connects to our publishing company, which is Pixel Lift Press. I'm fully accessible there. I think my phone number is right on the page. People text me and call me, and I just answer. Because to me, here I am talking about the human connections. It's overwhelming sometimes, but I love it at the same time, and I'm honest with people. I'm not available right now. I'm busy. Can we meet later? Can we set up the time to talk in a week? Whatever. I'm fine with that. I don't mind putting people off and being honest, but I would rather people reach out. So, I'd just say go to Alisona.com, see what it talks about there. And, you can click through to the publishing company. It's listed on the website, and all the contact information is right there. So.
Oh, that's awesome. And we'll be sure to put all that stuff in the show notes so folks can get that easy. Daniel, thank you so much for being on the Cool Grandpa podcast. I've enjoyed having this conversation, and hopefully people will take it to heart. I know this will be coming out in 2025, and hopefully this is the year folks will sit down with grandma and grandpa or mom and dad and record at least some stories.
Absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, if I can be a resource, I know your podcast is an amazing resource. Like, listen to this podcast and you'll have ideas, you'll have things to talk about, or even listen to this podcast with your grandparent. Send it to them and say, what do you think? Like that actually makes sense.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and I hope you have a good rest of the day.
You too. Thanks so much, Greg.